Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thank you so much for coming. My name is Amy Draves, and I'm thrilled to welcome Sydney Padua to the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. She will be discussing her graphic novel, The Thrilling Adventures of Lovelace and Babbage. It's a retelling of our history where Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage go beyond theory and actually build the first computer, and then use it to fight crime. Sydney Padua is a graphic artist, animator, and author of the steampunk webcomic 2D Goggles. Her work has appeared in several films, including The Iron Giant, Clash of the Titans, and John Carter. Her book has been featured on BBC's Tech Lab, In the Times, and Wired UK. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Hello. So this is one of the very, very, very first talks I've done. So be kind. If I choke, just someone poke me until I choke. So this is sort of a general purpose talk. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the comic or even with Lovelace and Babbage, although I presume at Microsoft, at least the name Charles Babbage might ring a bell. So how do I move this forward? Does this work? Yes. All right, so this is me. I draw this comic, generally speaking, in my spare time. Normally, I work in visual effects, sort of making imaginary giant monsters. That's what I do all day. I work on, when I put this together, I realized I work on blue and orange movies. I started out as a hand-drawn animator, and it's a bit hilarious to find myself giving a talk at Microsoft because I was one of the very last and most reluctant people dragged into computer animation backwards, leaving fingernail grooves in the carpet. But my relationship to computers has changed a lot over the last few years, and it has because of these two folks. About 5 years ago, I was in a pub. I'm usually in a pub, but 5 years ago, I was in a pub with my friend Sue Sharman Anderson. If any of you guys have heard of Ada Lovelace Day, it's kind of online festival for celebrating women in tech and STEM. She started this thing, and she said to me, Sydney, you're sort of a woman in tech. Oh, look, a microphone. Should I be talking into this or just talking like this?
You're actually, it's just here.
Oh, OK. Then I'll stand over here. So she said, you're a woman in tech. You should, you should do a blog post for Ada Lovelace Day. And I said, I have no idea who Ada Lovelace is. So I looked her up on Wikipedia, as anyone would do, and found this extraordinary, crazy story, which I thought, this is such a great story. This would make a really fun comic. So I did a quite short comic. If you're not familiar with it, or them, this is a speedy introduction. Ada Lovelace was indeed the only daughter of Lord Byron, the notorious poet, adventurer, and sex god. She was the only product of this marriage between him and Annabella Milbank, called the Princess of Parallelograms. She was a bit into math herself. When Ada was born, her mother was very concerned that she would become poetical, is the word they actually used. Byron himself actually also said, I hope that she is not poetical. I think this was a euphemism for mental illness, which ran in Byron's family. Annabella's plan for eradicating poeticality was mathematics, which is obviously the opposite of poetry, and therefore acted, or was supposed to act as this sort of countervailing force. So she brought up Ada on this diet of logic and mathematics, a very unusual education for a woman at the time. This was the 1820s. Lovelace was born in 1815, so this is her 200th anniversary, actually. So she met Charles Babbage at a party Babbage is leaning on his first calculating machine there, the difference engine. Babbage was Lucasian professor of mathematics, and he's very famous now as the inventor of a computer, which was never built, the Analytical Engine. Babbage and Lovelace became quite close friends. And then, unfortunately, they both died. Lovelace first by quite some time after she had written this big paper on Babbage's machine. So I did these were just some panels of this little, very short comic. I think it's about a 12-panel comic, just describing these events so that people would know who they were. I put it up online, I mean, I thought this was a miserable ending for a story. I work in Hollywood. We don't like unhappy endings. So I just threw in, as a joke, the following panel. Yeah, because, I mean, that sucks that they died. So this was actually a joke. It was, the gag was, wouldn't it be hilarious if there was a comic about Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage fighting crime? And it turned up the next day on a Wired blog as, this person is going to do a comic about Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage fighting crime. I succumb really easily to peer pressure, so I thought, oh, actually, that would be a really fun comic. So I think, by the way, this image here was heavily influenced by the Avengers. I was asking people, are people in the US familiar with the Avengers? Okay, yay! So yeah, I started drawing this comic where they fight crime. Generally badly, because it's very true to life, the comic. So their definition of crime is street music and poetry, which they've devoted themselves to the destruction of the arts, basically, and the triumph of mathematics. I've been drawing the comic for about 5 years. It's now a book available for sale at the back of the room. You should all buy it. It's now the thing about the comic is it's about it's mostly comics, but at the same time there's a lot of footnotes. I call it the mostly true story of the first computer. I've had this disputed because the comic is actually 30 pages of what actually happened and then 280 pages of crime fighting, which is not mostly true. However, it's mostly true by word count because of the footnotes. There's a Lovelace, of course, is famous for this paper. If you don't know the story, very briefly, Lovelace and Babbage had been hanging out, I guess I would say. Lovelace was very fascinated by the Analytical Engine, and she got a reputation as an expert on the subject, basically from listening to Babbage rabbit on about it for about 9 years. She was asked for this reason to translate a paper from the French, which was the only existing documentation of Babbage's engine published at the time. This was in 1841. It's very strange that Babbage never wrote his own paper on the machine, but because this was the only paper in existence, they asked Lovelace to translate it. Partly because for a woman to write an original scientific paper was not a thing that would have happened at the time, but translating papers from the continent was a known sort of accomplishment for women and considered the proper role. So she translated this paper, but Lovelace was not a proper woman for the time. She had her very, very specific own ideas and opinions, and she started adding footnotes. The footnotes were actually 3 times as long as the original paper. And it's in the footnotes that so much of what we now know as computer science appears. So here, for example, one of the great things I found when I started the comic, and I think anyone who has actually read it online as I was putting it up will have noted, is that I usually put a couple of panels of comic and then a whole bunch of endnotes. The comic was sort of my way of just sharing really interesting stuff that I found about them online. The comic coincided with the starting of Google Books and this kind of fantastic dumping of all sorts of Victorian ephemera onto the internet that was made searchable. And the great thing about that is that I could find just all these mentions of them from their contemporaries at the time and what they thought of them and what they thought of this project. You can read Lovelace's paper, for example, on Google Books. Although tragically, they haven't unfolded the program. The famous Bernoulli numbers program is actually a fold-out. And if you open it up in Google Books, it's just this sadly blank, unfolded paper. So it's a bit ironic and yet so appropriate in a way. So this is Lovelace's famous observation that the machine can work on general symbols. Babbage had designed the machine as an arithmetical machine for the doing of math. I'll show you at the end of this talk the reconstructions I've done of it in CG. But Lovelace, as a kind of theoretician of the machine, was the person who first said, actually, this is a machine for the general handling of information, not just arithmetical stuff. So that was interesting, of course, and very worthy. But I also started reading. Here are some footnotes, by the way. I probably should have flipped that around. But here you can see these wrong signs in there. One of the first things I read was Babbage's autobiography, which is fantastic, and everyone should read it. And in there, he describes the error pop-up, which is actually a thing. He was always, this is a very complicated machine with all sorts of widgets and bits. And I think this is one of the very first things I read that made me think that there's a lot of material for a comic in here. So not only does it come with an error pop-up, it comes with a continual loud bell, which I'm sure would be very delightful if you were the actual person programming the machine. So here's Lovelace debugging. You'll notice she's swearing down there. This is she did swear quite a bit in her letters. The Byron poetical and other nature was not eradicated in any way, shape, or form. Her personality to her contemporaries comes out a lot. I found this. Now, you can't read it because it's tiny and super blurry. This is from the New York Mirror, a tabloid, which says, "Oh, fie, it is said that Ada Byron, the sole daughter of the noble bard, is the most coarse and vulgar woman in England." She was quite weird. A lot of her contemporary descriptions tend to describe her as not successfully socialized or ladylike, which is what happens when you raise a child solely by mathematics, so I wouldn't advise it. What else did I find? So this is my gag on Ada Lovelace's computer language. There's tons of stuff on Babbage. One of the things I was really surprised to find, I think that the kind of imaginary, the popular view of Babbage is that he was this poor, misunderstood, obscure genius who created this amazing machine, but nobody appreciated or understood him, which is completely not true, actually. If you look at kind of the contemporary newspapers and whatsoever, stuff like that, Babbage was really hugely famous, and he was famous as a super genius who had invented this amazing machine, but everyone really wished he would finish it. This is from Punch. This is Babbage. He's very angry because he hasn't been given the appropriate notice for his machine from Prince Albert. I found there's all sorts of great stuff about Babbage because he had a very big personality. So there's literally dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of contemporary descriptions of Babbage. But I think this one is my favorite because it's just so typical. They put Queen Victoria's diaries up online, searchable, which I always love to see. And of course, the very first thing I did was put Babbage in, and this is what I get. Babbage just made a great fool of himself, as he does everywhere. Poor old Babbage. I like this. This is actually my absolute favorite. But there's so much Babbage stuff. It's actually really hard to pick out kind of specific stuff. There's a bunch in the book and a bunch more on my website. I link to all my primary sources, which you can read for yourself in full. My absolute favorite, though, and this is the true glory of searchable documents. This is from a private letter from this guy, Reed, who was an American poet who visited Babbage in I think this is 1854, 2 years after Lovelace had died. And he wrote a letter home, and then 10 years later, this letter appeared in the Southern Review, a very strange and very short-lived periodical that would print. I mean, it's a bit like a church circular. It prints all kinds of sort of random things. But one of the things it printed was this letter from Reed with this beautiful description, possibly, of Babbage trying to explain what computer programming is to some guy. The descriptions connected with this calculating machine, I fear I'm not expressing myself rightly as to the precise nature of the subject, which if it is computer programming that's being mentioned here, it's not surprising that he couldn't quite understand what the subject was. Anyway, it's really magical when you can read this stuff. It really brings them back to life as human beings. So I would encourage everyone to kind of poke around primary documents because they're great. Sorry, how am I for time? Oh, we're fine. Sorry, I've been told to keep this brisk, so I'm going to rattle through. Now, the one thing that I found in researching was the third character, I guess, in the comic is the Analytical Engine. And everyone's read the secondary sources, or Computer History 101 or whatever. The first computer was Babbage's engine. It had a memory. It had a processor. It was made of cogs. It was driven through steam. And it's so complicated that you can't possibly understand it. Now we're moving on. And this drove me nuts. I kept kind of paging through more and more dense papers trying to find someone who would just describe really how it worked and also what it looked like, because I'm a cartoonist and I just wanted to see a drawing of a big-ass computer made of gears, because who wouldn't? But no such drawing existed. This is, as it appears in the comic, it's this vast labyrinth of gears that's continually changing, which is kind of reflective of my own experience in dealing with computers. People are continually getting lost and attacked in there, as happens to us all. So here's the, so I'll just quickly go over, because you guys are computer people, so you'll probably find this interesting. If this is really boring, you should probably stop me. But just to kind of quickly go over the basics, this is the difference engine. I think when we say the Analytical Engine was never built, a lot of people say, but what about the one in the Computer History Museum? That's the difference engine. This is Babbage's first machine. It's a calculator. But so you can get a sense of what this machine would have looked like. Oh, I didn't cue it up. There we go. It's a beautiful machine. But it's an adder. That's the one carry. The rippling arms that go up the back are carrying the ones. But really all this machine does is add. It adds in a specific way for printing basically tables. In the days before computers, if you were, say, a navigator at sea trying to triangulate a position, or much more excitingly, someone working for a life insurance company trying to figure out compound interest over a course of 20 years, you couldn't just say, type it into your machine. So what you would use is these giant tables. You can pick them up for nothing, because every office had them. Volumes and volumes this thick of every conceivable iteration of a certain sum. So you'd say, I need to figure out this X% of this for this period of years. So you'd flip through, find that X%, and there it would be. The printing of these tables, of course, is a huge pain, especially because these were calculations done by human beings sitting in a room, working through each one of these calculations. They were full of errors. So this was why Babbage invented this machine in the first place. The theory being if you could mechanize these calculations, they would be error-free and faster. So the difference engine is an adder. It uses the method of differences. That's what it's called, difference engine. And although it's very beautiful, And it has especially this remarkable printer, which I think they show. Yeah, there's the printer, sorry. There's lots of stuff online about this. The workings of the difference engine are obviously extremely well understood because it's been built, and there's tons of great stuff on YouTube on how it works. Just doing the adds and then the carries. It's a lovely thing, but it's not the analytical engine, and that's the one I really wanted to know how it worked. Basically, in the early 30s, Babbage started to think, what if you could take the result that came out one end of the engine and then fed it back into the beginning and did something else to that number? He called this the engine eating its own tail. So he started doing all these designs for how to feed numbers back through and do different things. Over the course of about, he worked on the machine for the rest of his life in kind of spurts. When he was, this is the machine in its state when Lovelace wrote her paper. He kept moving things around, which is one of the reasons it's so hard to find diagrams of it. But this is the most complete overview of the engine, so this is what I used. So you can see the, did I get a pointer? I'll just point. You can see the, this is the store. You can't quite read that. This is storage, the memory. This is these giant wheels that turn around and carry the results around. I'll show, it'll be clear when I show you the animation in a sec. Basically, I took this and started doing elevations, which was actually by no means straightforward because there is no proper elevation of the engine, so I had to kind of cobble it together. But as to the best of my understanding, it would have looked like this. Punch cards are on the bottom. That was kind of my first surprise. I always picture them at the top, like a jacquard loom. They're on the bottom. The whole thing is driven by these cams. It's got these barrel controllers, which I'll explain in a sec. This is possibly a little small, actually. Each of those columns, the vast bulk of it is numbers. Each of those columns represents a number. This is 40 decimal places, so you just have little cogs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, going up with, each layer is 1 decimal place. So this is 40 decimal places high. Babbage ideally wanted it 50 decimal places, which he described as being, as far as he could see, necessary for all future purposes of science. I think actually 50 decimal places is extremely unusual to use right now, so I think he maybe overdid it, but Babbage always liked things to be as perfect as possible, which is probably why he never actually finished the machine. It's got cats on it because I like to draw cats. So how does this, what are we looking at here? This is a bit of an overview. This is from the book. But the clearest way to explain it is probably to look at the animation. This is way obviously sliced down, simplified. I've stripped out everything. Babbage never used one lever when 50 would do. So he's always linking everything with these wonderful Rube Goldberg devices to make things faster and more error-free and to make the operations more efficient. Hopefully this will be clear. It actually took 3 different kinds of, I should loop this if I can. It took 3 different kinds of cards to run a program. It's got the operations card. This is the famous programming. This is the addressing system, the variable cards, and then there's the number cards on the far end. So what's happening here, if I can I step frame? No. Dang it. So I'll just run it. The number cards are just a card with each number as holes. They push against the levers. If there's a hole, doesn't activate the lever. If there's no hole, it pushes the lever. So you have each decimal place down. Each one will have one spot with no hole, activates a lever, reads the number out onto the store. So this is only one decimal place, right? This machine would actually extend upwards. So each of those little gears would then register whatever the number was on the card. So that card then is read onto the store, onto the memory. So once it's got the numbers into the store, next thing that happens, this I'm a little fuzzy on, and actually Babbage kept changing it. Just very Babbage. Whether the operation card sets the operation first or the variable sets the address first, not quite sure. Just for clarity, I'm having the operations card set up. This is the mill, and each of these sections does a different mathematical function. It could add, subtract, multiply, divide. That's all the engine could do. It had actually specific, for speed, it had specific sections for multiplying by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. It would break the number up, multiply each bit kind of in a chunk, put it back together. It's a very, very, very complicated machine. This is just to kind of explain how the information flows through. The operation card operates the barrel. It's incredibly clever, and it's incredibly like machine language in a sense. Each operation card will operate one lever. The lever will rotate these barrels around, and the barrels have rows of pegs. It actually controls three different barrels at the same time. Each of those barrels has 80 pegs or so going up and down. They push forward. You'll see it in a sec here. That's the address. Wait, back up. Back up a little more. The barrel pushes forward, and those barrels will activate dozens and dozens of levers at once to set up everything necessary for a specific calculation. So if you have the operations card says, I want you to add the numbers that are going to come in, it hooks up the adding system. So it will as you see, select the little pinion. Just will bring the pinion up and then send it, basically channel it over to this section from the addresses on the variable card, which has the address. In building this machine and in trying to describe how it worked for the book, I started to understand why everyone said it's so complicated that it's hard to explain. It is, in a sense, quite a simple machine. Like all these bits, even I can understand, so they must be pretty simple. But it's how they all combine together. There's lots of stuff happening at the same time. So yeah, storage, ingress. So it feeds everything into the ingress. The ingress sends it to whichever section, depending on the operations card. Operation does its thing. These are all very specific little bits. Sends it back out to the outgress, which can go to the printer or back into storage. So when they say it's basically a modern computer, they're not kidding, because every part is basically there. Yes?
So how big was the storage? How many numbers did it store?
Babbage left this up in the air. As you can see, actually, if I go back, in this plan, you can see the storage just goes off the page. Everyone wants more storage. His basic design had 100. He had mentioned the number 1,000, but he basically left it. Ideally, obviously, it would have millions of these things. You're very constrained by the racks. Go back forward. The racks are just these giant racks with teeth. Like it's a physical thing, and the longer the storage is, the longer the rack has to be, and it's just a rack and pinion, so it's turning this. You have this little pinion, turns the thing and pushes the rack over however many units. So mechanically speaking, the longer the storage is, the longer the racks get, and the more room you have for something to go horribly wrong in moving the numbers around. His later designs moved the mill, the kind of calculation bit, the CPU, into the middle and put the storage down either side, so it's a bit more square than this. But I don't have proper plans for that, so I didn't do that one. Right? These are just some more animations of bits. All mechanical. these are, this is basically how I worked. I would just take a plan. Fortunately, I'm an animator, so I have this kit around just to build it. I mean, for me, to actually be able to build the machines was vital to understand them. Babbage's genius is absolutely incredible when you think that he was doing this stuff in his head. So if you think in terms of spatial reasoning skills, it's pretty spectacular. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of parts to the machine. This is the barrel controller, and the famous, or it's not famous, the obscure, unless you're me, conditional arm. This is what gives the machine the ability to loop and do feedback. Certain results could send calculation back through the system. So it has this little arm that drops down if you get a certain result. Back that up. The theory is, whoa, stop. Spoilers. The theory is that Lovelace got the concept of this machine as a logic machine. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I'm using the wrong button. I need to stick to the mouse. There we go. No! Stop. Wait, not touch that one. Oh. There we go. Oh, of course. Yeah, I have to keep running. If the lever falls down, then it will activate. If there's no lever there, then it won't. So it's an if-then function. This is known as Lovelace's leap. Babbage put that in there for mechanical reasons. For pure math, there's no evidence that Babbage ever thought of it as a logic machine. Also, logic was not there yet. Logic at the time was still Aristotelian logic, basically. This is about 10 years before Boole. But a lot of people were working on mathematical systems of logic, including notably Lovelace's teacher, Augustus de Morgan, who was teaching Lovelace mathematics. And that's probably where she had this conception that you could put Babbage's analytical engine together with a mathematical logic system to handle information generally and not just arithmetic on the machine. Just to cap it off, the punch card system, of course, was based on the Jacquard loom. Now I can't go forward, please. There we go. I took a trip up to, I just thought this might be fun or interesting for programmers. The Jacquard loom, of course, required thousands of cards to do these patterns in cloth, and they have these wonderful machines for stitching. This is a giant sewing machine for stitching the cards together. And this is a piano punch on the other side here, which is how you punch the program onto the cards, basically. So you push the buttons, and it makes the little holes, so you read along the pattern and punch it in. So I designed for Lovelace her programmer organ out of these two machines.
Is that thread up there?
Oh, yes. Yeah, of course. You need a lot of thread to hold the programs together. So that is hopefully not too long or boring or confusing. Sorry, this is my first time doing a talk. Hope it went okay. Thank you. I guess I'll take questions at this stage. Yes?
So just glancing through the first bits of the comic, it seemed like you start using the term difference engine instead of what's going on?
Okay, I'm getting a lot of stick for this. Obviously, the difference engine is the crappy, simple adder machine. The analytical engine is the far superior, giant punch card controlled computer. Babbage would not be pleased to see me using the term difference engine, but it's just way cooler than the term analytical engine. And if you just say to the analytical engine, it doesn't have the same ring to it. So I am helping spread confusion and misinformation by calling it the difference engine. But William Gibson did it first, so that's my excuse. Yeah.
So who's going to direct the movie?
Me, of course, because I'm a control freak.
I more envisioned like a Downton Abbey version.
Oh, very good. Yeah.
Two things. One is how was his work funded, and then was there really a speaking tube, and what would that be used for?
Babbage, of course. Well, of course. I say of course because I've been immersed with this stuff. The story of Babbage and government funding would make a extremely boring but very lengthy comic. Babbage got an enormous sum of money to make the difference engine. £17,000 is the official figure, I think. Even at the time, they described this as the cost of 2 warships. It was kind of the first disastrous government IT project. Babbage worked on the difference engine for 10 years or so. I think 23 was when he got his first grant to do it. There were several reasons why he didn't finish it. The main one probably being that he was Charles Babbage. Babbage was a perfectionist and not much of a people manager. He was very extroverted, he loved people, but he wasn't very good at kind of handling a crew. So the difference engine fell apart. Then he came up with the Analytical Engine, which was so obviously superior to the difference engine that he abandoned the difference engine, much to the government's disgust. He tried to get funding to the Analytical Engine, but of course, if you haven't built a difference engine, then it's hard to get like 3 times as much money to build a much more complicated machine. In terms of how he funded his own researches Babbage was independently wealthy. He was loaded. He was like the classic gentleman scientist, kind of one of the last ones really of this, guy who had tons of cash and was really smart. So he just messed around with it really on his own dime. What was the second question?
Was there really a speaking tube? Is that your imagination?
That's my imagination.
Okay.
This machine does not exist. I
No,
didn't
I understand that, but I just wondered if there was any, because of the size of it, maybe he envisioned a need to be able to communicate with somebody on the other side for fixing it. I don't know.
I think it would be too loud. The Analytical Engine in running would have made a hell of a racket. I don't think you could have heard anything. Yes.
So I noticed that there's lots, and I enjoyed them, the lots and lots of footnotes on every page. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me that it sort of mirrors the relationship between how Ada Lovelace wrote a bunch of footnotes to the Charles Babbage's paper, or sorry, the paper describing his machine. And I was curious if that really long footnote thing was a specific and purposeful allusion to that relationship, or did it just sort of evolve from what you were doing in making a mostly fictional account?
It definitely evolved out of the nature of the comic being a blog. It's people call it a webcomic, but I think real webcomic people would object that there's not enough comic and too many notes. But it was definitely ultimately a joke about Lovelace's footnotes being the real meat of the story. Yep.
Are you familiar with Seattle's own Phil Foglio and Girl Genius?
Ah, yes, of course. I didn't know he was from Seattle, though.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, neat. I'm way less prolific than Phil Foglio.
But you have your own Girl Genius.
There you go.
Yes.
Yeah, I used to read his stuff in Dragon magazine back in the day. I'm that old.
Well, he's still around, so.
Oh, that's so neat. Other questions?
Is the comic still ongoing?
Yes, I think so. I've got a lot of comics I'd love to draw, but this is not my day job, both financially and time-wise. I'm working visual effects with it, which, if you know anyone who works in visual effects, is not the most free-timey sort of let-it-all-hang-out occupation ever. So it's very hard to find time, especially right now.
So does the book then contain everything that has yet appeared, or?
Everything except Organist, which that's, if you don't know the comic, the longest running story by a good ways is Organized Crime. But that is actually 150 pages long. So it's kind of mostly cleaned up, so we might do another book with just Organist and a couple of other things. Any questions? Wow, I was
Thank
that clear.
you so
Oh, you're most welcome.